Louis Pasteur, Battle with Death by Dorothy Hawes. If the people of little Louis Pasteur's village in France had been asked to guess what he would become when he grew up, few would have said he would become one of the world's greatest scientists. Little Louis, they would have said thoughtfully, well, have you seen any of the pictures he draws? They are really very good. He will probably grow up to be an artist. Some of the scientists' boyhood drawings still exist. Artists agree that Louis Pasteur's scientist could have been Louis Pasteur, artist. Run for your life, mad wolf! A boy pushed open the heavy doors of his home. He slipped inside, slamming it behind him, his heart pounding. Little Louis Pasteur, for that was the boy's name, turned. He brushed aside the lace curtain on the window next to the door. The scene outside was something out of a maddened, snarling wolf, foaming at the mouth, charged down the street. Panic-stricken people scattered before it. Some found shelter. Others, not so lucky, were bitten. Little Louis closed his eyes. He pressed his face into the scratchy lace of the curtains, but he could not shut out those dreadful cries. Soon the howls of the suffering beast faded in the distance. Then they stopped altogether. The wolf had gone back to the dark forests that surrounds Arbois. Silence returned to the tiny town. Once more Louis dared to look outside. A pitiful parade was passing by. One by one the wolf's victims were being helped up the street. They seemed to be going to the blacksmith's shop. Louis pulled open the door and followed them. What he saw there was to haunt him for the rest of his life. The only known treatment for rabies, caused by a bite of a mad animal, was a fearful one. Each of the wolf's victims, 8 in all, was brought into the blacksmith's shop. There the doctor touched a red-hot poker to the wound. He was trying to burn away the poison left there by the sick wolf. But the treatment was useless. In the weeks that followed, the wolf's victims sickened. At last, one by one, they died. There was no cure for rabies. Many years passed. The little boy of Arbois grew up. He studied chemistry and biology. He became a scientist, an honored scientist known throughout France. In his laboratory, he found the answers to many grave problems. The farmer's sheep and cattle died in great numbers from a certain disease called anthrax. Dr. Louis Pasteur found a way to vaccinate them, and so to keep them healthy. Many people became ill and died from drinking the milk of sick cows. Dr. Pasteur developed a method of making milk safe. We still use that method today. It is called pasteurization. Many were the problems that Dr. Pasteur solved. But during the years, he could not forget the cries of the terrified townsfolk of Arbois. The trouble was that no one knew quite where to start on the fearful problem of rabies, for no one knew what caused the disease. Today we know that it is caused by a virus, a germ so small that it cannot be seen under the usual kind of microscope. But Dr. Pasteur did not know this. One day he was in his laboratory with his assistant. They were talking about rabies, as they often did. The elderly scientist, limping from an illness which had left him painfully crippled, moved up and down the long room as they talked. "We do not know what causes rabies," he said. He paused for a thoughtful moment, leaning on his cane. "But every problem has an answer," he went on, "and to every answer there is a clue. Let's start looking for a clue. We will begin with the sick animals themselves." In the weeks that followed, strange guests came to live in Dr. Pasteur's laboratory in Paris. Mad rabbits, mad guinea pigs, mad dogs. The scientist studied the disease in these animals. He even studied the saliva, which he took from their foaming mouths. But he did not find his clue. He worked long hours He was in the laboratory, bent over his microscope, long before his assistant opened the door in the morning, and he stayed on, lost in thought, long after his assistant went home for the night. Months went by. Many times Dr. Pasteur thought he had the answer, only to be met with failure. But he did not give up. And then, at last, the long hours of work had their reward. He injected nerve tissue from sick animals into healthy ones in a certain way. He found that in doing this, he could cause rabies in healthy animals. This was because the germs were concentrated in the nerve tissue. And this turned out to be the clue that Dr. Pasteur had been waiting for. He found that by letting the tissue stand for a few days, it became weak. When a dog received the weak tissue, it became sick, yes, but not so sick that it died. The dog got well, and after that, even if injected with the strongest nerve tissue, the dog did not develop rabies. Its body had built up strength against the disease. The dog was immune. The scientists knew that persons bitten by rabid dogs did not show signs of illness until nearly a month later. If resistance could be built up in these people before they showed signs of the disease, perhaps they might not sicken at all. He worked up a course of treatment. It would take 14 days. On the first day, a dose of a very weak 14-day-old nerve tissue was to be given to a person who had been bitten. This was followed on the second day by a 13-day-old dose, and so on until on the last day strong virus was to be given. During this time, the person's body would be building up resistance. Finally, the victim would have so much resistance that he would not get sick. Dr. Pasteur had found his cure for rabies, or he thought he had. It had been successful with dogs. Would it work as well on a human being? Perhaps it would harm rather than help a person who had been bitten. At last, he decided what he would do. He would try the treatment on himself. If he was not harmed by it, then he would be sure that it was safe for everyone. But something happened before he had a chance to test his cure. It happened on July 6, 1885. Footsteps sounded on the stairway leading to the laboratory. The door was flung open. A woman rushed into the room. "Dr. Pasteur," she cried when she spied the scientist. "I am Madame Meester. I have heard you are working on a cure for rabies. You must help my boy Joseph, or he will surely die. We have come all the way from Alsace." She turned and pointed to a little boy. He stood in the doorway smiling shyly at the great scientist. Joseph Meister was 9 years old. He had been bitten 14 times. Dr. Pasteur stood up, shaking his head. "But my good woman," he said, "the treatment has never been tried on a person. It may harm." "Please, doctor," the woman pleaded, "you are our only hope." The scientist was thoughtful. "Let me think," he said. "I will let you know later today." After Madame Meester and Joseph had gone, the scientist sat down at his desk. Should he use his treatment? Would he be risking harm to a human life, perhaps? Joseph could live in spite of his wounds. He talked to his friends, Dr. Grancher and Dr. Vulpian. These two men knew of his work. They went with him to examine Joseph. When they finished, they turned to their friend. "The boy will surely die," they said, "but if you try your treatment, he at least stands a chance of living. By all means, try it." Treatment began that very day. In the days that followed, Dr. Pasteur and Joseph became good friends. The scientist watched his little friend worriedly. What if the treatment did not help? At last, the day came when Joseph received the last and strongest dose of the nerve tissue. Dr. Pasteur waited. That night the light in the laboratory burned on long after all the other houses in the street grew dark and silent. Morning came. The sun rose. The city came alive with the sounds of horses and heavy wagons in the street below. Suddenly there was a sound of flying feet on the stairway. Once more the laboratory door burst open and Madame Meester stood there. "Dr. Pasteur," she cried, "come!" She was gone. Louis Pasteur limped hurriedly after her. At last he reached Joseph's room. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. What would he find inside? Would his little friend be well? Or would he pushed open the door. There, sitting up in the big bed, was a smiling boy, a pale but healthy Joseph. Beside him stood his mother, tears in her eyes and a smile on her lips. Joseph gave a little bound, setting the old woman bed to creak. "Good morning, doctor," he said to his friend. The scientist could not answer at once. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Thank God, his little friend was alive and well. At last, once and for all, Louis Pasteur was able to erase from his mind the cries of the people of Arbois.